Welcome to the Grace Story Podcast, where inspiring stories are brought to life. This podcast is made possible by Grace College and Seminary, located on the shores of Winona Lake in the great state of Indiana. I'm your host, Dr. Drew Flam. This is the Grace Story Podcast. Today on the podcast, we have Pastor Larry McCall. He served as pastor of Christ Covenant Church in Winona Lake, Indiana since 1981. In addition to pastoring, he enjoys speaking at retreats and conferences. He has written a number of articles and is author of 3 books: Walking Like Jesus Did, Loving Your Wife as Christ Loved the Church, and most recently, Grandparenting with Grace. Pastor Larry received his BA in New Testament Greek in 1976 and MDiv in 1979 from Grace College and Grace Theological Seminary. He went on to complete his Doctor of Ministry at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. Larry's aspirations is to be a useful tool in the Lord's hand, spreading the fragrance of the knowledge of Christ through his life, teaching, and writing. When Pastor Larry gets time to relax, he enjoys spending time with his wife, Gladine, being with his kids and grandkids, reading books on history, and paddling around on his kayak. Pastor Larry, thanks for being on the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, Drew.
I this past summer, speaking of being on the water, went to a water ski show, and you showed up at that same water ski show with a gaggle of kids in hand, all wearing matching T-shirts,
Yes.
Teenagers to toddlers. And I learned you were doing some sort of a grandparenting camp. And we're going to get more into grandparenting, but tell me about grandparenting camp and how can I get my kids to go to my parents' house for grandparenting camp?
Well, you need to talk to them, Drew. But yeah, for the last 3 summers, Gladine and I have taken 5 days out of our summer. And we invite all of our older grandkids. There's a baby that hasn't been involved yet, but the 6 older ones come for 5 days. They stay at our home, and we have it planned out well in advance. We call Grand Camp, and the grandkids look forward to it so much that we dare not do it. But we always have a theme. This past summer, when you saw us, our theme was Walking Like Jesus Did. And so we had devotionals, breakfast, lunch, dinner, and bedtime, just short devotionals, 5-10 minutes, on the character of Christ and how that should be impacting our lives and at their season of life. But then we do lots of fun stuff, too. We play in the backyard, do an obstacle course. We eat ice cream, but only once a day. Go out to see different things in the community. It's a great time. And at the end of those 5 days, we have, happy grandkids, happy grandparents, and tired grandparents. And the parents have enjoyed that time for us having the kids, too.
I was going to say, that's got to be a tiring time. Hopefully you have a little leftover ice cream for your R&R post-grand camp. That sounds like a lot of fun. So if you want to invite me next summer, I can block it out on my calendar.
Well, we'll show you how to do it. And then 20 years from now, when your boys are parents, you and Stephanie can do it.
We want to get into your book, Grandparenting with Grace, but I want to back up a little bit and talk about just where you're from and how you and Gladine got to Grace College just a few years ago.
Yeah, a few years ago. Thank you so much. That's kind of you to say it that way. Gladine and I both grew up in the small coal mining community of Katanning, Pennsylvania. And neither of us were from real academic families. We were always encouraged to learn and to read, but none of our parents went to college. And I love to tell the story that when I was about 16, I said to my dad, Dad, I want to go to college. And he said, well, I'm not going to stop you. So I had to kind of find my way. And I knew a couple people that had come to Grace, Terry White being one of them. He was from our home church. And then my older sister was here for part of her college career. And so I applied to Grace College. That was the only school I applied to. And I came in 1972 and decided rather quickly to major in Greek because I wanted to learn the Bible, especially the New Testament. And then my wife, Gladine, we were high school sweethearts. She's a year younger. I know she looks a lot younger, but she's 1 year younger than I. And she came out the following year. And so we enjoyed our years of Grace. Those were good years.
You ended up then going into pastoral ministry. Was that your intention in studying Greek to eventually move towards the pastorate?
Yeah. Yeah, I think since I was about 16 or 17 years old, not every man experiences this who are pastors, but I had a definite inward sense, inward call, if you want to refer to it as that the Lord wanted me involved in pastoral ministry. So from the time I was in my late teens, that's the direction I was heading. And yeah, we came to Grace. And then, interestingly, I'd already decided by my middle year of seminary that I wanted to do what today would be called a pastoral internship. They didn't call them anything back then because guys didn't normally do that. And but I found a little Reformed Baptist church in Pennsylvania, not too far from where we grew up, a couple hours away, that was willing to take me in for 2 years and try to knock off some of the rough edges. And so we were there during that time, and it was a wonderful experience, learning more practically how to do ministry, having gotten the academic training here, but needing that pastoral application. And while we were there, I got a phone call from a friend of mine here in Winona Lake that said, we're seeing the Lord direct us to start this new church. We're looking for a pastor. We can't pay you anything, but would you come? And so 2 years after seminary graduation, 1981, we moved back to Winona Lake, Indiana, got a job at night at Owen's Supermarket, unloading trucks, stocking shelves, and started pastoring this little group of people. And about a third of the early church, the church grew to about 100 people within that first year, about a third of them were associated with Grace. It was exciting.
That's neat. And you've since multiple locations and continued growth, and now Christ Covenant Church is just, a hop, skip, and a jump down the street from Grace College. What have you seen from the college and seminary over the years? How has it changed from your perspective, being next door neighbors over the last close to 40 years?
I was talking to Dr. Kate within the last year, and I said, Bill, a lot of times when people our age, he and I are similar in age, I said when a lot of people our age refer back to their college career and we say about the current situation, well, it's not like it was when I was a student. I said, Bill, I can say that, and what I mean is it's better now. I'm so excited to see what the Lord's done with Grace Schools in the last 40 years. It's been a delight to be in here in the community almost that entire time since I was here as a student in the 70s. And just seeing how the Lord's at work in the lives of the faculty, the administration, the students, I'm excited to see not only people being taught the Word of God, students being taught the Word of God, but there seems to be a lot more emphasis today than there was 40 plus years ago on the difference that should make in daily life, the difference that should make in local churches. And so I'm excited to see what God's doing. My kids-in-law are all Grace alum. Now our grandchildren are talking about coming to Grace, so we're very pro-Grace.
Send them our way. Send them our way. We'll take them. You pastored for a long time, and then started writing some books and teaching a little bit more broadly. And was that also something you saw yourself doing in those early days, becoming an author and a speaker? Or how did God call you into that vein of ministry?
Well, thanks for asking, Drew. No, when I was a young man, I never anticipated necessarily being an author. I certainly enjoyed reading. I enjoyed books. But back, somewhere between 15 and 20 years ago, Jerry Bridges, who was one of my mentors, was at our home. And Jerry said to me in our dining room one evening, he said, Larry, you really need to write. And he had heard me speak, and he said, if you write, you'll be able to minister to people you never meet. You'll be able to impact places you never go. And he was encouraging me to broaden my ministry by writing. And so he was very kind to kind of launch me in that direction. So when Walking Like Jesus came out 15 years ago, he wrote the foreword. And people saw that book and said, I don't know who this Larry McCall guy is, but Jerry Bridges, maybe I'll pick that up because his name's on the front too. And so that kind of launched me in a direction that I had not anticipated as a young man. My first book came out when I was about 50. So, this wasn't something that I started as a young man.
Wow. and you've written 2 subsequent books, and the most recent being Grandparenting with Grace, Living the Gospel with the Next Generation. So let me first ask this question. Why did you write this book?
That is an excellent question, my friend. 4 or 5 years ago, Gabe Tribbett, who's on staff here at the seminary, was in charge of what we call life education classes at Christ's Covenant Church, or I think a lot of Grace Brethren churches refer to them as ABF, same concept. Gabe came to my wife and me and said, would you two be willing to lead a class on biblical grandparenting? And we looked at each other, and we looked at Gabe, and the first thought that came to my mind was, what? We'd never heard of a class on grandparenting. We'd never been in a class on grandparenting, but at that point we had 6 grandkids and we loved being grandparents. And so we told Gabe yes. And so having committed without any sort of reservoir to draw from, we began to dig into the Bible. What does the Bible teach about grandparenting? And if you do a search, you're only going to come up with a couple of hits on the word grandparent or grandmother or something like that. But if you look for phrases like generation, to tell the next generation, sons and sons, sons, the Bible actually has a lot on grandparenting. And so we started researching the Bible to teach this class, and then I started looking for books. And you can do your own search. Do your own search on Amazon on books on biblical grandparenting. And what we discovered was there are mountains of books on parenting and on marriage, but almost none on grandparenting. And the few that are out there are primarily what I call anecdotal, people telling their stories. You know, I taught my grandson how to fish. You should teach your grandson how to fish, which is fine, but could you give us some Bible? And we did find a handful of books, literally a handful of books on biblical grandparenting that had already been written 5 years ago. During the course of that class, I had several people come to me individually and say, Larry, you really need to write on this subject. There needs to be more on this. And so we worked on this manuscript. New Growth Press was interested in it, and they've since obviously published it. It came out last August. And since then, on that whole process of writing that book, Drew, we discovered several other people who share our passion to help equip Christian grandparents in the ministry of grandparenting. And so there's this budding Christian grandparenting movement, and Gladys and I have become part of that. And even last week, we're in California for 3 or 4 days, meeting with 15 or 20 other church leaders to pray and to plan. How can we impact churches across America, across North America, to equip grandparents in the ministry of grandparenting? So didn't see this coming. 5 years ago, if you had asked me, are you going to write and speak on grandparenting, I would have looked at you like, where'd you get that idea? But it's becoming a dominant part of our lives and ministry in the last year or two.
Why do you think there is a growing movement of interest in biblical grandparenting, or in an emphasis in grandparenting that maybe didn't exist to as great of an extent previously?
Yeah, how the Lord has worked that providentially is still a bit of a mystery to me. But I think part of it is my generation, baby boomers, the great majority of us are moving into our grandparenting years and love being grandparents. But among evangelicals, what are we supposed to do with this? That conference we were at in California last week, the leader of that, a guy named Larry McCall, said that there are about 30 million professing Christian grandparents in North America. Not just grandparents, professing Christian grandparents, 30 million. And statistically, as far as we can tell, less than 1% have had any biblical training in the ministry of grandparenting. So do your math. Now we're talking 30 million Christian grandparents. The average number of grandchildren is about 4. And so you do your math and you start realizing there are tens of millions of grandchildren out there who have Christian grandparents, and yet the grandparents are not intentionally building into them God's truths, God's gospel. And so there's a huge need. And I think as one book here, another book there, a conference here, a conference there is out there, some more social media stuff. More and more grandparents are becoming aware that, hey, this is something I never thought about. So it's growing, and we prayed last week when we were together in California that the Lord would start a revival among Christian grandparents. We were praying big prayers.
That's great. Okay, I must admit something, Pastor Larry. I have not read your book. I'm hoping not to be a grandparent anytime soon. But I've bought a couple copies and given them to both sets of parents.
Yes, thank you.
And they have appreciated them. But give us a couple of highlights of biblical concepts that you discuss in the book about grandparenting with grace.
Yes, thank you. Obviously, we grandparents can't give grace to our grandkids. So when you hear that title, Grandparenting with Grace, we're not the dispensers of grace. Only God can come and change a young child's heart or a teenager's heart. But the gospel should shape our lives as Christians. And some of us Christians are grandparents. So the gospel should be shaping our lives to such an extent that the coming generations, our kids, our grandkids, and for some, great-grandkids, they should be able to look at us and say, oh, that's what the gospel does in daily life, in an individual. And to see the gospel shaping Gladine's in my life as a grandfather and a grandmother to the point that the kids watch us in life and they begin to see this stuff about how Jesus changes people, it makes a practical, a functional difference in daily life. Papa lives this way because of Christ. Grandma lives this way because of Christ. So it not only shapes our lives, but it shapes what we talk about. And so when we're with our grandkids, there's an intentionality to point them to Christ. And it's not all we talk about, but it underlies all we talk about. And there are intentional times when we talk to the grandkids about their hearts. But then, too, the gospel shapes our relationships. And so some families, we're not thankfully in this group, but some families have a lot of tension. Okay, well, how does the gospel come to bear in living in a family that's full of tension? Christ is patient with us. Can I be patient with my son, my daughter-in-law? Can I be patient with that wayward grandchild? Why should I forgive that family member who hurt me? And you begin to see the gospel shapes not only how we live individually and what we talk about, but even our relationships intergenerationally. So when we talk about grandparenting with grace, it's even though it's a short book, it covers a lot of ground. It covers those issues that every grandparent lives with.
Do these concepts that you're talking about apply more broadly? I think of those who are listening who may not be grandparents or may never be grandparents, but they're an aunt, an uncle, a cousin, a brother, a sister. Is there broader concepts about what it means to be a family member and living with grace?
Yes. I think that the principles that we write about in Grandparenting with Grace should impact people that aren't grandparents yet. And we've had people come to us.
So I should buy the book and read
should.
it is what you're saying. Okay, all right.
Yeah, tell Stephanie to put it on your wish list. I think people that read the book that are maybe parents, like you and your wife, your 3 boys, you see principles in there that are transferable transgenerationally. And it should impact that way. And Drew, one of my passions, I've given most of my adult life to pastoral ministry, and I've loved being a pastor most of the time. But I see how churches, local churches, need to be challenged to equip grandparents in the ministry of grandparenting. Think about churches that have a family life division. What's that mean in most churches? It means, well, we provide equipping, we provide training and parenting and a marriage. Praise God. Excuse me, there's at least one more generation you haven't talked about yet. Are you equipping the grandparents in your church to come alongside the parents? Different role, same goal. Are you equipping grandparents to be involved in family life in a way that would honor Christ and help the family? And so very few churches have given much thought to equipping grandparents. And I'm on a mission as not only someone who loves being a grandfather who's written on grandparenting, but as a pastor. I want to help other churches know better how to do this.
Let me ask a couple of very maybe practical implications or situations and how the principles might apply. My parents live in Fargo, North Dakota. Who knows why you'd want to live there, especially in February as we talk right now, but 14 hours away. And they love our kids, want to be engaged in their life, are wonderful believers themselves, but there's a distance barrier.
Yes.
And they don't get to see them but twice or three times a year. How does this play out for a grandparent who may be states, hours away from their grandchildren?
Yeah. It's interesting you asked that question, Drew. I read a statistic, and I'm trying to remember exactly what it is, but it's something, I'm pretty close here. Close to half of the grandparents in North America have at least one grandchild that lives 200 miles away or farther. And so it's a real common phenomenon in our mobile society to not live near grandkids. And I think some grandparents live in that reality of being long distance and feel like, well, I guess I'm not going to be that involved with my grandkids. And I want to lovingly push back and say, oh, there's a lot you can do. And so what I encourage long-distance grandparents to think about are three different issues. Could you go to them? Now, one of the advantages that many of us in my generation are facing is we have more time available, either retired or semi-retired. We have more money available. Our child-rearing years are behind us. So do you have the time and money that you could go to them? We have some friends in the Christian grandparenting movement who all of their grandkids live at least a flight away, not driving distance. But they have determined, budgeted the time and money to fly to visit each grandchild on his or her birthday. Now, not everyone can do that. This couple can. But when they told us they do that, I thought, that is an investment. And their grandkids are growing up knowing that grandpa and grandma come to see me every birthday, even though it costs them hundreds of dollars and days of time. Or can you invite them to you? Can you invite the grandkids to come to you? Holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas are popular. Why not take a family vacation together in the summer? Or have a grand camp. It's a great memory maker. But then something else in our day, almost all grandparents could do, is video calls. 4 of our grandkids live in Michigan. We live here in Winona Lake area. Every Tuesday afternoon at 1:30, Gladine and I have a Bible study with 2 of those 4 grandkids, the ones that are old enough to read. And we've done this for 2 years. The kids know that 1:30 on Tuesday, Papa and Grandma are going to call. And we just did it a few days ago. We've enjoyed very much walking through the Bible in a very personal way, praying with them individually. We get a half hour with each of them. And it really builds relationally. And it's very intentional in pointing those grandkids toward Christ. So I just want to encourage long-distance grandparents, don't give up too quickly. Look for opportunities. And even if your grandkids are on the other side of the world, if they have an internet connection and you have an internet connection, you can talk to them, you can see them, and make regular calls that way. There's always other ways, too, just text messages, especially with teenage grandkids. Land mail letters, remember those?
Not really, no.
Yeah. There's plenty you can do. So even long-distance grandparents can still be very involved and very intentional.
Well, okay, let's, I also want to ask about not just working with grandkids, but parents, right?
Yes.
Because some grandparents may have kids who either are not following Christ, or at least their faith is not mature, and yet they want to invest in grandkids, and there can be friction with parents,
or at least tension, yeah.
Or tension, yeah. So how do you navigate, or what are principles to navigate that parent relationship as you work to intentionally invest in grandkids?
Gladine and I personally have a wonderful relationship with all of our kids and kids-in-law, so this isn't our situation, thankfully. But I've talked to grandparents who've been told by their kids, we don't want you talking to our kids about spiritual things. We don't want you teaching our kids about God. That's really sad. And yet I think as grandparents, we need to realize that the parents do have primary responsibilities for those kids. And so we don't want to overstep our bounds and cause more problems. So what I encourage the older generation to do in those contexts is love your kids, love your kids-in-law well. They're individuals. They're not only the parents of your grandkids. They're individuals that you should love for the sake of Christ. And so to develop a loving relationship with maybe that unconverted son or daughter, son-in-law, daughter-in-law, remembering birthdays, remembering anniversary, just calling and not even talking about the grandkids for a while. Just call and say, how you doing? How's that new job going? You told me you were struggling with this or that. How can I help? And to build that loving relationship with the middle generation for God's glory and their good. But I think even in those situations, even if grandparents are kind of blocked spiritually, we can still model Christ. We can still exude the benefits of the gospel in our lives that should pique the interest of our grandkids, if they want to know why we're different. And I think over time, and obviously too, we want to just saturate that whole thing in prayer. But in those contexts, to see what God will do over time, he might open up some doors that we didn't see opening. And we should be people of hope and faith.
That's helpful. Thank you. You mentioned holidays earlier, and I think, that's often a time when families are together, not always intentional maybe with our time together. Yeah. We're just there. Talk to me about some ways you guys use, Christmas or Easter or Thanksgiving, whenever it is that your family, gets together for a few days together to be intentional about that relationship and about pointing your kids and grandkids to Christ.
Yeah. I'm blessed with a wife who's very intentional as a grandmother, and she's always feeding me ideas and conversationally discussing ideas we could do. But for instance, at Christmas time, we often have out-of-state kids and grandkids with us in our home. And so, I'll ask the dad in the family, are you going to have devotions with your kids at night, or could I? What would you like me to? But we always try to have a devotional time at bedtime with the grandkids, with either the father or the grandfather leading, or we could take turns. Prayer time. But then on that particular holiday, we'll always try to bring the Bible to bear. So reading, the Christmas account from Luke 2 or Matthew 1 when the grandkids are with us. We got younger grandkids that love doing productions. And so we'll often have the kids do a play, and Gladys and I will maybe research online possible plays for this age bracket of kids, maybe tweak it to fit our grandkids. We've actually gone out and bought like shepherd costumes, wise men costumes, things like that. And so we'll put on a play almost every Christmas. And if the kids get older, and we do have some older grandkids that are kind of outgrowing that, we'll have them be narrators. We'll get their input. I've been a wise man. I've been a donkey. Don't go take that too far.
There you
go. But Easter time we'll do something similar, where we'll maybe have a reenactment of the resurrection. Kids and I have built a stone that rolls away. I mean, we've done all kind of stuff. I mean, out of cardboard.
And that parlays into something I want to ask about too, which is fun, right? Like it's there's aspects of building a stone that rolls away together that would be a blast, right? Any fun ideas or particularly exciting or things you guys have done that is like, that one was really fun?
Yeah.
I recommend this one to all grandparents. Try this out. It was a blast.
Yeah, I think when you asked that question, one thing that came to my mind immediately is our annual obstacle course for Grand Camp. And we weren't intending this to be a repeated phenomenon, but it is at the grandkids' request. That a few years ago for Grand Camp, our theme was Wise Up. And we used Marty Machowski's book, Wise Up, which is on the Proverbs. And so many of the Proverbs have to do with listening to wisdom, to turn a deaf ear to the voice of folly, foolishness. And so we did an obstacle course in the backyard. Each of the grandkids takes a turn to be blindfolded, and then they have to make it to the obstacle course blindfolded, listening to the voice of wisdom, which in our case, ironically, is my voice. And they have to listen to Papa's voice. In the meantime, their siblings and cousins are shouting at them to do something different than what I'm saying. So there's this cacophony of the voice of folly, and one voice, the voice of wisdom. So to make it through the obstacle course successfully, they have to listen to Papa saying, step up, turn left, crawl through, whatever, and turn a deaf ear to the voice of folly. The grandkids have gotten so into the obstacle course, they want to plan it now. They're the ones that lay it out. And it's an annual tradition in our family in the summertime to go out in the backyard. You could do it inside too, but we do it in the backyard. And that's just a great learning opportunity for the grandkids.
I love that bringing together biblical truth and fun in a way that is going to be memorable to your grandkids. And when they think of wisdom, they're going to think of the obstacle course.
Yes.
And in the midst of whatever they face in life, that's going to come back to them at some point in some way, because it wasn't just preaching at them. It was also a very real example of what this could look like or how this looks like.
Yes.
Truth applied to an obstacle course.
Well said.
So
Truth applied.
I really think that's a neat way to do it. And I so appreciate how creative you and Gladine are in the ways that you express truth to your kids and grandparents. It's just amazing.
Thank you.
So I have to ask one question that my parents told me about. They said if they knew this grandparenting thing was going to be so fun, they would have just skipped the parenting part.
Yeah, I've heard that one more than once. I've probably said that before.
But you still love the parenting part too, right? And that's what's
sure
great
do.
about this. All these principles apply to parenting as well.
Yes. And Drew, your comment there about how much we love being grandparents, when I get out there and speak on this subject, I don't think I've met a grandparent yet who doesn't love being a grandparent. But think about it. Of all those people that love being grandparents, how few have had any training in grandparenting? And so you heard that love of grandparenting. Now let's see what we can do to serve those grandparents by giving them some training.
Well, speaking of that, what is the best way to connect with you? Where can they get your book? Where can they find where you may be speaking or talking about the topic of grandparenting?
Yeah, the book's available on most Christian book distributors. Amazon, of course, is the biggest by far. But you can actually get it from the publisher at a pretty good price. It's New Growth Press. And New Growth Press gives quantity discounts. So if you want to go through the book with another group of grandparents or maybe a class at your church, they're very generous with their quantity discounts. So I try to steer people to New Growth if they're interested in doing this with some other grandparents. As far as my speaking goes, I have a website. It's Walking Like Jesus Ministries, WLJministries.org. And I don't know that the current schedule's up there right now. We just lost our guy that was doing a lot of our webmastering things, but we'll try to get it updated. But it gives the email address and stuff. People can contact me directly. But I enjoy speaking on this. I'm heading out Saturday to go to Detroit area to speak on grandparenting. So it's a delight to serve this way.
Thank you for joining us on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Drew.
And thanks for listening to the Grace Story podcast. Music was written and produced by Dr. Wally Brath, Assistant Professor of Worship Arts at Grace College. Thanks to our co-producers, Andrew Palladino and Rick Neer. And if you can do us a huge favor and rate, comment, or share this podcast from wherever you retrieved it from, we'd be so grateful. Until next time, live your best Grace Story today.